Unmute. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join in today. I am Jason Kunisaki, the Salt Lake JCL co-president. As you know, we will be having a virtual book discussion today entitled Setsuko's Secret Series, Salt Lake City and the Japanese American Community, Past, Present, and Future. Feel free to post your location and organization in the YouTube chat, and if you have any questions during any part of this discussion, please post those as well. I want to give a huge thank you to all of our speakers today for taking the time to join in on the discussion, many of whom are prominent members of the Salt Lake City Japanese American community, including Dr. Jeanette Misaka, Floyd Mori, and Judge Raymond Uno, who are all featured in the book Setsuko's Secrets. I also need to give a huge shout out to my fellow Salt Lake JCL co-president, Trey Imamura, who's going to be giving some perspective as a younger generation member of the Japanese American community. And then thank you to Shirley Higuchi, who's the book's author, as well as everybody who worked behind the scenes to make this event a reality. I also need to give a huge thank you to our co-sponsors from the University of Utah, Westminster College, and the Salt Lake County Diversity and Inclusion Office, as well as from the Utah Valley University. I also need to give a thank you to the Utah JCL chapters for helping to advertise this event, as well as a thank you to the King's English Bookstore for sponsoring the event. And if anybody wants to order an autographed copy, order fast from the King's English Bookstore while supplies last. The bookstore is located in Salt Lake City on 15th South and 15th East. So definitely check them out if you're in town, or you can order the book online if you go to the King's English website. And lastly, I want to thank the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation for reaching out and getting this event set up. One of the missions of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation is to support outreach efforts that highlight the lessons of the Japanese American confinement and their relevance to the preservation of civil rights for all Americans today. And my grandpa was interned at the Heart Mountain internment site. So I really appreciate and fully support everything that the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation stands for. So with all that said, I'd like to first introduce Judge Raymond Uno, who is a key character in Setsuko's Secrets. Judge is the first ethnic minority judge in Utah's history, a civil rights and community advocate, a trailblazer, and mentor to many. Judge Uno was incarcerated in Heart Mountain as a young child. His contributions to the community are immeasurable, and he continues to advocate, encourage all those around him to continue to preserve our history and make our community a better place. He's an advisor of the fundraising committee of the Minetta Simpson Institute. And so with all that said, Judge, take it away.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. It's my pleasure to join Shirley, Jeanette, and Floyd here on this panel. They and Shirley's parents have been part of my life for almost 80 years. Although I spent the first years of my life in Utah, it's only through multiple changes of fortune that I am here today. My family moved to California, San Gabriel Valley in 1937. Readers of Shirley's book will discover that my father, Clarence, rigged the back of a pickup truck as a bed for my sister and me as we drove at night from Ogden to California. My father worked as secretary for the San Gabriel Valley Japanese Association, helping the community navigate life in the area. When Pearl Harbor happened, the FBI came to question my dad, but he luckily avoided being taken away then. My parents, brother, and sister and I ended up at Heart Mountain. That's where I met Jeanette and Shirley's parents, Setsuko and Bill, and the camp school. Just a few months after we got to camp, my dad, who was a World War I veteran, died in his sleep after attending a USO meeting. After the war, his death meant we had nothing to return to. My mom had to find a place to live, and she found work in a women's group home back in Ogden. My brother and I had to live somewhere else because she couldn't have boys living in her quarters at the women's home. She worked a second job in a local news department. During the summers, I worked on a railroad cruise across the West. After graduating, I joined the Army and studied Japanese in the camps and latrines at night. That meant I spent the Korean War working in intelligence unit in Japan. After the war, I returned to Utah and went to college at the University of Utah. I joined the JACL and got to know Jeanette Misaka again, as well as her husband Tatsu Misaka and his brother Watt. I became a lawyer, and with the help of Jeanette, Tatsu, Watt, and others, I eventually became the JACL national president. We pushed for redress and eventually got it with the help of Floyd Mori, who would lead JACL in the future. Seth and Bill Higuchi moved to Utah in 1981. Seth became active in our Heart Mountain reunions, including the successful 202 event in Salt Lake City. All of us worked to build what stands today at Heart Mountain. I got to know her when she succeeded her mother on the Heart Mountain board. I'm proud of what we accomplished there, and I'm happy to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much, Jason and Judge Uno. I'm Ray Locker. I'm the editorial consultant for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. It's my privilege to host this panel with Shirley Higuchi, Dr. Jeanette Misaka, Judge Uno, Floyd Mori. They're all pillars of the Japanese community here in Salt Lake, done a great job. Before we get into the panel discussion, we're going to show a short film about Shirley's book, Setsuko's Secret, and then we'll get into the panel. Thank you.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's Secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for it can't be helped. There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice.
Well, thanks for that video. Every time I see it, I get moved by the story of Heart Mountain and of Shirley's book, Setsuko's Secret, which I had the privilege of helping her do some research on, and I think she did a great job with it. I'm going to introduce our panel now. Obviously, Shirley, whose story you just heard. She is Senior Director for Legal and State Advocacy at the American Psychological Association, Chair of the Board of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and author of the book Setsuko Secret, which we're discussing now. Dr. Jeanette Misaka, a former Heart Mountain incarceree, former University of Utah educator in special education. Hers is a story of tremendous perseverance from the time that her family was taken from Santa Clara County, California, to Heart Mountain, and then to central Utah, where her dad ran a farm. I had the privilege of interviewing her for not only Setsuko Secret, but for an article in the Pacific Citizen I did about her, Judge Uno, and Shirley's dad, Bill Higuchi, who are all recipients of the Japanese Order of the Rising Sun. Finally, but not lastly, Floyd Mori, who's had basically every honorable position in the Japanese American community, as well as being a former mayor of Pleasanton, California, former California State Assemblyman, leader of APACS, and Japanese American Citizen League president at the time when they finally issued an apology to the draft resistors. So I'm pleased to have all of them with me today. And the first question will go to Shirley, which is, You've never lived in Salt Lake City, but it has played a critical role in your development as a leader in the Japanese American community. Can you describe how?
Well, as my book talks about, my family did grow up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And as a result, I think both for me and my mother, we were very isolated from the Japanese American community at large. But after being at the University of Michigan for about 20 or so years, my dad did accept a position of chair of the pharmaceutics department at the U. And at that point, he was able to, with my mother, connect with Jeanette and connect with Raymond. And it was sort of a full circle in terms of bringing my mother Sets into the Japanese American fold. So she became a bit of an activist. She was more engaged, as Judge Uno had expressed. My mother co-chaired with Raymond and Jeanette and others this very successful Heart Mountain reunion at the Little America. I believe it was in the early 2000s. I was actually there. And I think that was really her awakening. So, but for Salt Lake City, but for Jeanette and Raymond, I don't think my mother would have had the fire to dream of something being built there. And unfortunately, when she passed in 2005 of pancreatic cancer, and she turned the baton over to me through the board, we were able to fulfill her dream eventually in 2011 with the grand opening.
Great. Thank you, Shirley. I also need to note that Floyd is also a recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun. So kudos to him and to all of you. Jeanette, go to the next question to you. You knew Shirley's mom at Heart Mountain. Tell us what you remember about her and who she was. And you're on mute.
Jeanette, you're on mute. Tina, can you help her?
Okay.
Okay, am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. I really didn't know Shirley that well. I'm not Shirley. Sets that well. I keep saying Shirley, but I didn't know Sets that well in camp. We only knew each other in passing, said hello and such in the hallways of the school. But I remember her as being a very tall, because she was much taller than I, in Heart Mountain, tall, slim, very nice looking and well-dressed. And, you know, there are people that you meet once and you remember them, and for some reason or other, they seem to come popping back in your life later on. So 60 years later, I got to know Sets as a friend. She came to Salt Lake City. Well, actually, it was her husband, William Higuchi, was applying for a position at the School of Pharmacy at the University of Utah, where I worked. And one of my colleagues was, her husband was the dean of the College of Pharmacy. And we were talking, and one night he called me and he said, by the way, I remember you said you were in Heart Mountain. Did you know William Higuchi? And I said, yes, I remember him by reputation. He's very smart, intelligent young man. He's very studious, I remember. And I said, let's see, who's his wife? I was just wondering who his wife was. And he said, Setsuko. And I said, oh, I know her too, by name only. And then that's how I got reacquainted. When they came in, then we got together and with Raymond, and that's where our story started. And like Shirley said, we wanted her to join us because we're having the Heart Mountain reunion, the 8th Heart Mountain reunion here in Salt Lake City. And she jumped right in and helped, and she really helped us a lot.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Floyd here. Floyd, you grew up in Utah, but you spent much of your professional life in California and Washington, D.C. What are some of the differences between the three places and why?
Well, Utah, where I grew up, born and raised, my dad was an immigrant from the early 1900s and became a farmer in Utah, raised 8 kids, but we lived sort of in the rural areas. So as a child, my experience was, our family. And in the summers, I look forward to going to picnics with Japanese Americans. So there were those kinds of activities, but by and large, the farming community of Utah had little contact with the Japanese community as a whole, except on celebration occasions. When I moved to California after I graduated from college, I lived in a community called Pleasanton. And Pleasanton is sort of the outskirts of the Bay Area. And interestingly, not a lot different than where I grew up, except it was more urban. It had been farm area, the county fair was out there, but the Asian American population was very few. I could count Asian American families on my one hand, I think, during that period of time. So the environment was different, but we had access to San Francisco, San Jose. We had JACL chapters. We created a new one out in Pleasanton when I lived there. And so my experience and knowing a little bit more about camp and incarceration was enhanced. In fact, as a kid, my relatives came and lived with us during the war. They talked about camp, and I really didn't know what camp was. Maybe summer camp, Boy Scout camp, something like that. But I didn't understand what camp was until I really mingled a lot more with Japanese Americans in the Bay Area and began to learn. And of course, that was the time when redress began, and we became very much involved in that whole process. In Washington, D.C., where we retired to after our stint with JACL with my private work, I worked with JACL and with the organization called APICS, Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. There, Washington had a lot of activism, as you can imagine. We had an organization called the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, now consisting of, I think, of over 30 organizations. Back in the day, it was JACL and later on OCA. And we also engaged with other non-Asian organizations in the Leadership Council of Human and Civil Rights. Of course, there was CAPAC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. There was, again, a relationship to Congress. And while I was there, we had a lot going on with the White House because there were Asian Americans in the White House, and there was a White House initiative on Asian Americans. So the three places were distinctly different in terms of relationship to Asian Americans and the amount of Asian Americans around. But I think today we see a lot more activism as we see the chapters of JACL and the community organizations, student organizations maturing here in Utah.
Great, thank you. The point you made about growing up in rural Utah in a farming community is similar to the experience that Shirley recounts in the book with her dad. I mean, he grew up on a farm near San Jose speaking Spanish because he was with, Mexican kids who worked on a farm and lived on a farm. So it was really only when they were incarcerated did they see a whole lot of Japanese Americans. Shirley, I'm going to go to you for the next question. Going back to Utah and Salt Lake City, what are the special characteristics of Salt Lake City and Utah that are favorable to the Asian American community?
Well, I really do feel that what makes Salt Lake City special to me is the rich Japanese American history and actually how connected my family has been to Raymond Uno's life, as well as Jeanette Misaka's life and other Japanese Americans in Salt Lake. And it really, it's very symbolic. I think that if you think about Salt Lake City, and as Floyd had mentioned, he grew up here, and his family, although they were affected by the war because he had family members who, went to war and fought on behalf of this country, was also a safe haven for Japanese Americans because they were not incarcerated like the fellow Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So I think that safe haven, that protective nature of Salt Lake and the values, I think, and I really felt this when I participated in the Asian American Pacific Islander rally that Floyd put together last May for Asian American Month. But it's a really strong and important community. And what I really feel is the strength that not only do the adults and the Nisei experience here, but it's also their children and their children's children. I know that Tina is helping Jeanette right now, her daughter, and we have 2 young people who are leaders now of the JCL locally. So I just think that it's a very special place, and I'm grateful to be here participating today. But again, my history with Raymond, if you could give me like 2 minutes, because it's in the book, but it's not emphasized really clearly. Raymond Uno and the JCL was the only connection that I had to the Japanese American community when I was growing up as a little girl in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I remember, I think it was in 1968, my parents used to get the Pacific Citizen newspaper. And I used to read about the Japanese Americans, in particular, Judge Raymond Uno, because I remember he had a column called Uno Bar. And I used to read that. And so I felt that was sort of the beginning of my knowledge base in a very limited way, because there was no information on the incarceration in my high school history books, none whatsoever, as well as college. And I must add also law school, if you could believe it, at Georgetown. So thank you, Judge Uno, and thank you, JCL.
I'll just follow up briefly on what you mentioned with the information gap. Heart Mountain is doing something this summer to try to fix some of those problems. Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation was lucky to receive a pretty large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're bringing in 72 teachers this summer. And we're going to be teaching them about the Japanese American incarceration experience and providing them with a curriculum by our faculty. And so all these teachers from all around the United States are going to go back to their school districts. And you figure if one teacher has 3 or 4 classes a week with 30 or more students, we're going to be able to reach thousands and thousands of students who know nothing or not much about the incarceration through our teacher workshops. So I think it's a great thing.
Great, thank you. Jeanette, back to you. You came to Utah in a roundabout way. You were originally from Santa Clara County, where your father was a very successful farmer. Can you describe how you got here and why you and your family stayed in Utah after the war?
Okay, well, my father had some friends in California that he worked with that knew that he was a good farmer. So they contacted him in Heart Mountain and asked him to come out of camp and start farming again because of his skills. And so they gave him several states that he could go to. And one was Utah. And so he thought, well, he'd been to Utah twice, passed through Utah twice, once when he went to college in Chicago, and then the second time was something to do with JACL just before the war. And so he said, well, Utah sounds like a good place. And so that's how he got to Utah. And he had heard about the Mormons and their persecution in establishing the state. And he thought that was that they would understand our situation. And so we decided to come here. However, that was not always true, the story about the Mormons, because the first place they came to in central Utah, it was very close to Topaz, and they had a very difficult time there. A lot of discrimination, and they were ganged up on. So my dad said, I'm not bringing my family to this town. And so they found another town further north, in a little town called Sigurd, which is, I always say I'm from Litchfield because Litchfield was the school that I attended and was a little larger. Sigurd was a small town and had maybe a church, an elementary school, a cemetery, a grocery store, and a gas station. And if you blinked, you passed right by it. But anyway, that in that community, there was a large farm that was owned by the Snow family. And they were cattle ranchers or something. And it was a large farm that the owner, Nina Snow, wanted to lease. And so Dad looked into it, he liked it, and he liked Mrs. Snow because she was so gracious and welcoming. He said, okay, we'll take this unit, this particular farm. And so that's how we got to Sigurd, Richfield. And we stayed.
And then you went to the university after you graduated from high school.
High school, yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you met your husband and his family and decided just to
Right, exactly.
put down roots.
It's like connecting the dots.
Yeah.
And that's where I met Ray back again because his sister and I were roommates in college.
Oh, okay. I didn't remember that. That's interesting. All right. Floyd, you mentioned briefly, that when you were in California, you got to know more people who had incarceration experiences. I was just wondering, what was your connection, to the incarceration growing up in Utah?
When evacuation occurred, some relatives moved in with us. And, I was just a child of 4 or 5 at that time. And when they moved in with us, we moved to a different farm further out in the boonies in southern Utah, Salt Lake County. But these relatives were voluntary evacuees from the West Coast. They lived in San Pedro, and they were the group of people who had sponsors inland. We, being their relatives, were able to somehow sponsor them, and they came and lived with us on that farm. And then on the farm that we moved to, we had a family from Watsonville that came to live with us and work on our farm during the entire duration of the war. And they had a son my age, so in the first grade, I had a Japanese American person in the first grade with me. Later on in my life, I got married, and my wife's family, again, were one of the families that voluntarily evacuated from the West Coast during World War II. They luckily had a truck, the Mono family, and so they were able to load some things beyond a couple suitcases, and they moved to a very rural part of Utah where now it's a reservoir that's not even there anymore. And then finally moved to near Salt Lake City. And that's where my wife's family grew up, and my wife's father stayed in Utah rather than going back to California. My relatives all moved back to Utah, back to California, and continued their life back there. It wasn't easy for them, but they continued their life back there. But it was, as I mentioned, in Utah, while I was there, we didn't really talk about it a lot. It wasn't a topic that we wanted to talk about, and those that had been incarcerated didn't want to talk about it. So, we didn't know a lot about camp. I didn't know about Topaz till later on in my youth. So, but we had that connection with people who were forced from the West Coast.
And so, you have this family, these relatives of yours show up and move into your farm. Did anybody ever explain the reason why they were there?
Well, they didn't explain to me. I wouldn't have understood, I'm sure, at that age, but Of course, they had sons that went in the Army like my brothers did. I had two brothers who went in the Army, and the Nishinaka family had sons who went into the Army too. So there was that part of the war, again, that most of us really didn't understand at all.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Shirley's Aunt Thelma, who eventually lived in Salt Lake City during the war, also went through a similar experience. Her family lived in Santa Clara County, the Takeda family, and then they moved inland in California because they thought that would be far enough away from the places where people were being forced out. But they didn't move far enough, and they ended up in Gila River until Shirley's Aunt Thelma was able to move to Salt Lake City. And this is something, that we encountered a lot during the research of the book. Shirley, we want to talk a little bit more about some of your other relatives who moved elsewhere and how they were able to find sanctuary in Salt Lake.
Well, remember, Thelma came to Salt Lake to work for Mike Masaoka, as I understand it, and she worked for JCL, so that she was able to get out of her predicament by coming to Salt Lake to work for Mike. And she actually had a wonderful career. She ended up after the war going to Japan, and she was in the same building with General MacArthur and would see him in the hallways, which I always find fascinating. She's still alive now and living in Frederick, Maryland. She's, 96, 97 now. 99, I'm sorry. I keep on missing those years. It's crazy how quickly the time goes. 99, so she'll be 100 soon. But in terms of Salt Lake, Thelma is probably the best example of that. And then my parents are a really good example. And again, it's Raymond Uno, again, has just stood out so much historically. And I actually jotted a few things down. I don't know if the audience would be interested. I think I kind of have a spiritual side to me. And I think things are kind of strange at times. But I really first met Raymond in 1968, as I mentioned, when I would read about him, and I heard about him through the JCL. And then my parents moved here around 1981. And I remember my mother calling me up and saying, I think Raymond Uno is in Smith's grocery store, and I'm like, why are you telling me this? But I mean, she ran into him, I think, at a store, and then later they got together and they worked with Jeanette. And then in 2005, my mother died of pancreatic cancer, and Judge Uno came to her funeral and gave the eulogy. And then in 2015, he officiated the wedding for my first and only son, and the only grandson in the Higuchi family. And then today in 2021, we're together on the Zoom call. So Judge Uno, I just think that there's been a lot of touch points that you've had in my life throughout, half a century of my life, where I find it fascinating that today we're still together after all these years. So thank you very much.
If he can hear me, I'd like to ask Judge Uno a question. Going back into his experience in law and wondering, as the first ethnic minority judge in Utah, what are the changes you've seen in Utah and its acceptance of minority groups, and what do you see as the future?
Well, in Utah, it's kind of unusual because it's a state dominated by one religion. And I'm not very religious, so I'm always in between everything. And my acceptance here in Utah is kind of unusual because I've always tried to stay under the radar and in a dark corner, but for some reason I get involved in something and then I find myself out in front instead of in the back. But anyway, my experience in Utah has been very, very unusual, and for me, kind of exciting because I don't try to get to be involved in anything, but for some reason I get involved, and when I do, crazy me, I always have to go 110%. So I've enjoyed my time in Utah and in Salt Lake City and the Japanese community here. And I think that Utah has been a very hospitable place, in Salt Lake City, especially for Japanese and I've always enjoyed my relationship with all the people, and I keep running into this lady next to me, Jeanette Misaka, for one reason or another. We've been classmates, and at the university, she was a good friend of my sister at 339 South 13th East. I'll never forget that address, but we used to have so much fun there with a group of people that used to be students at the University of Utah.
Great. Thank you for that. Floyd, you mentioned earlier that your father had immigrated to Utah from Japan. What brought him to the state? And you're on mute.
My father was from Kagoshima, and his father was not a well person. I mean, he was sort of sickly, as I understand it. And so at the age of 16, my father immigrated to the United States to help support the family. He was the oldest son. And he came to Hawaii for a little while, made manju, as I understand, and then got to San Francisco a year later and worked in a restaurant, and finally found out that he'd making a lot more money working on the railroad. So he worked on the railroad across California, Nevada, and Utah. And while in Utah, he got injured and ended up in the hospital. And he decided at that time to start farming. And that's when he started farming and began raising kids, 8 of them, from the north part of Utah, later on moving to the south part of Utah and ending up in Salt Lake County. But my father, I think, intended always one time to get back to Japan, but family, World War II, just a lot of elements kept him here in Utah, and he became a very respected neighbor to people around him. He was large of stature for a Japanese. He was always the guy in the middle of that picture of Japanese guys, and the tallest of them all. But he worked hard. He was a good example to us as kids, and lived a long life till he was 84 years old and passed away.
Did he ever go back to Japan?
They visited Japan a couple times after the war. They went back to Kagoshima. He took my mom back there, and it was it was a place that got bombed a lot, because when the planes had leftover bombs, they bombed Kagoshima on the way back to wherever they were going, to their aircraft carrier or to Okinawa or wherever they were based. And so the place was devastated. So they came home sooner than they intended, because it was in such bad condition. But he went back a couple times, and they did a lot of research in their family, and which has been beneficial to us.
Great. Shirley, that reminds me of a story about your grandfather Higuchi and your grandmother, and how they had intended to move back to Japan after the war. And then they actually did try in the mid-50s and encountered a lot of difficulties, and it wasn't quite what they expected. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and what you learned during your last trip to Japan?
Well, if everyone has a chance to read the book, there is one chapter that talks about right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, how the families were reacting and the stress and the struggles. I think there was a lot of stuffing of Emperor Hirohito material. Anything that was Japanese was destroyed or burned. So I think at that time period, both sets of grandparents probably were thinking, geez, should we go back to Japan? And during the research, we found out that my mother's father and mother, very late in the night, before they had to be evacuated by force, they were really seriously considering going back to Japan, which I think would have been a big mistake. But so that was sort of a dicey situation. I'm sure that My grandparents on the Higuchi side were wondering as well. However, they did own that 14.25 acre in San Jose. So they were more concerned about what's going to happen to the farm. And that created a lot of conflict as well, as you can imagine, because my grandfather wanted to hold on to it and take a chance. But my grandmother thought it would be too vandalized. So they really, ironically sold it to pennies on the dollar to an Italian American family, which, by the way, they still live there. And it's so ironic that Japanese Americans had to be rounded up in camp and lose their property, but the Italian Americans were able to stay in San Jose. But after the war was over, my grandmother Higuchi and grandfather Higuchi in the 1960s went back to Japan and intended to stay there because, their English wasn't as good as most people. So they felt that they would find comfort there. So they were there for several months. And, what happened there was that my grandmother Higuchi unburdened her experiences at Heart Mountain to her niece, who's now like in her late 80s in an assisted living center in Saga Prefecture. And that was the first time I learned how distressed my grandmother Higuchi was, because she never talked about it with her children or with me, because she didn't want to burden us with her incarceration stories. But she unburdened herself to Sumiko. And that's the last chapter in my book, where Sumiko tells me more about my grandmother's emotional distress and trauma from her incarceration that I never heard from my immediate family members.
Okay, thank you. Jeanette, I got a question. We talked about this earlier, and one of the things I find fascinating is that you and your family were photographed by legendary photographer Dorothea Lange when she was doing those photographs during the forced relocation and incarceration. Do you remember much about that? And can you tell us what you do remember?
I know that they came to our farm and they took a lot of pictures. That's all I could remember. But here's my picture in camp. A little closer. Whoop, can't see it. That's okay. And then, no, we don't show this. What was the question?
Just what you remember about the photographer Dorothea Lange and being photographed. Did you have any idea then that you were being shot by such an iconic photographer whose pictures would remain, fundamental to this whole experience?
Right, and that our pictures would be in the Library of Congress. It's amazing. But anyway, yes, she came and she took pictures of the farm and Dad and wrote a very nice story, but apparently those stories were kept. They did not publish them in the magazine at the time. And so they're now starting to come out. But anyway, this is, here are some of the drafts of the pictures. This is one of the sitting in front of the farmhouse. And this is my dad and my little sister. And then this is my picture of my grandfather. And this is the picture. I went to the Smithsonian after college and saw this picture in the We the People section of the Smithsonian. And that was my grandfather. And I see that in a lot of the films that keep coming out, but not identified, but it's my grandfather. But let's see what I didn't have the farm pictures there. Yeah. So she just took a whole bunch of these kind of pictures. This is this big farm.
Yeah, I remember that photograph in particular of the one of your dad standing out in the farm field.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's it. Okay. Yeah. And
I believe your dad was a Nisei, which would make you a Sansei, which
yeah. My dad was the first JACL president in San Jose, 1930. It started in 2930, so.
Right. And so did he own his property?
No,
okay.
he had been leasing the property And the year that he had been doing very well. That was the year that the war started, and so we lost that. But he had invested, instead of investing in the land, which he probably should have done first, he invested in equipment. And so he had, like 2 Caterpillars and about 3 John Deeres and things, all, because he was a mechanized farmer, did that kind of farming. And so, and his partners all kept that for him during the time that we were in the war. So after the war, then he was able to retrieve some of that. And that's how we got our farm started in Utah. So yeah, we lost out there land-wise. Because
he was an agricultural pioneer in the area.
Right.
And, yeah.
But if you go to Mountain View, Moffett Field, just south of Moffett Field is that big property that Dad owned, leased. And now it's just filled with homes.
Right. And I think that's the same situation with the Higuchi family farm that was in San Jose. It's all been subdivided into various homes. Shirley, you've had a chance to go back there in recent years. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, in some ways, you would think that owning your own land is a proud thing to have. But in 1942, and if you were Japanese American, it was a bad thing if you didn't have anyone to take care of it. What happened with my family in San Jose was that the land was held in the names of the 2 eldest sons, James and Kiyoshi. And they weren't even old enough to drive or vote because the discriminatory law, the alien land law, they wouldn't let my grandfather own it. But somebody was smart enough to let the 2 oldest sons, who were just kids, own that land. And so the story goes that James Higuchi, who was already in the military as a medical doctor, by the way, and actually his family knew the older son of Norm Mineta, who was also a medical doctor in San Jose. But he was stationed in California, but then they shipped him off to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. I'm sure that was part of a evacuation, internal military evacuation. And he was forced to sign away the land rights because, my grandparents couldn't keep the property. So here James in his uniform is standing in a notary in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, signing away the 14.25 acres that for many, many years, my grandfather suffered to really build that farm up, and it was all, lost because of their evacuation into Heart Mountain, but yeah, we went back. I went back there with my father and my Aunt Emily, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain, and my James's wife, who, by the way, is also turning 100 next year. And we drove in the rain around that whole area where they used to have the property to see what it was like. And they're just homes and hospitals, and it's just very different.
Interestingly enough, now we have 2 former presidents of the JACL with us today. It was the first president of the JACL, Saburo Kido, who helped engineer that land purchase deal for your grandfather with your 2 uncles. Which is kind of a transition to Floyd here. One of the things that's coming up in Congress that you've been working on with Heart Mountain and some of the other Japanese American groups is the passage of the Japanese American Confinement Education Act. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your role in passing the Japanese American Confinement Sites bill in 2006?
Yes, a challenge to our community has always been nobody knows what happened in World War II. The internment is just unknown by most people in this country from coast to coast. And so back in 2006, there was a coalition of Japanese American organizations, including the JACL, brought together by some of Gerald Yamada back in Washington, D.C., who began to think of putting together a bill to fund some educational projects to let people know what happened during those days and to preserve the camps so that people could learn from the camps. And so when I became the national president, we were in the midst of that campaign, and also as executive director, that was our big challenge, is to go door to door, office to office in the House and in the Senate, getting senators and Congress people to sign up. And it was very fortunate at that time that, it's been mentioned, I served in the California Assembly, and my first seatmate in the California Assembly was a man by the name of Bill Thomas, who represented Bakersfield, California. And Bill Thomas, by 2006, had gone to Congress many years before. He became the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which was the most powerful committee in the House, had all the purse strings. And he was a friend of mine. We became friends. He was a Republican, I was a Democrat, but we became friends. And unlike today, we helped each other. And so when I went to visit him, he asked me what's going on with the JACL, and we explained the bill. And he said, Floyd, I have some experience with internment. And he said, I'd be happy to carry the bill for you. And of course, I about fell off my chair. But with a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate and a Republican president, he was able to get that bill through. $38 million was allocated to preserve the camps and to provide educational projects to help America understand what incarceration was about. Well, this year that money will run out. And so we are now working to reestablish that, to take away the sunset of that bill and add another $38 million for the same kinds of programs. But thanks to Speaker Pelosi, we're also adding another $10 million that will provide educational opportunities for other institutions to educate America about what's happening. So, this is an ongoing process. Even today, a couple of weeks ago, I took a group of people down to Topaz and to the museum and out to the site. And these are people that lived in Utah for many, many years, and they had no clue that that happened out there, and were amazed at what they learned at the museum, and were appalled when they went out to see what the site was like, where people were forced to live. So we continue to have that challenge, work to do, and that bill today, 1930 is the name of the House bill. We ask everybody to contact their members of Congress and senators to support that bill and get it passed soon so we can continue this program. It's been very beneficial to most of the camps. Heart Mountain has benefited, Topaz has benefited. I know Manzanar in California, most of the camps have benefited because they've been able to provide opportunity for people to learn about it.
Great, thanks. One of the things that I found interesting about all of that is, many of these camps are in rural areas, often represented now by Republicans. And you notice that in some cases, like with the Amachi in Colorado, the representative from there, Ken Buck, a Republican, supports that bill by Doris Matsui, as do, I think, 3 of Utah's 4 representatives,
Yes.
Which is a sign that, people, when they know about this problem, are willing to, step up and support it and help educate people.
Yeah, right. I think, just like anything else, people understand the situation they're going to support. And this is the case with new congressmen in Utah and the Western states who weren't there in 2006 when the original bill was passed. And of course, weren't there during World War II. So many, again, have to be re-educated about that so that we don't let that happen again to other people.
Right. Shirley, I believe you had a comment, and then I'll go to Jeanette and Raymond to talk about this next.
A comment about the
Education, etc.
Oh, I think that what Floyd's doing it with, along with the Japanese American National Museum, JCL, National, Heart Mountain, Minidoka, we're all working together. We put together funds. And I think if we get what Floyd just says, you're going to see more education, not only from Heart Mountain, but from the other confinement sites. So I'm really excited and grateful. And I hope to God that, the Republicans and Democrats could come together for something that they actually came together before on, which was a reparations bill and other activities. So if anyone could do it, it's us. So I hope Floyd can make that happen with David Inouye of the National JCL.
Great. Jeanette and Raymond, what your personal experiences with talking to people about the incarceration? How many folks, over your history have you found that didn't know anything about it before and have had their minds and kind of attitudes changed once they actually met people who had been incarcerated?
Go ahead.
Well, in Utah, we've done a lot of workshops, teacher workshops. I worked for the State Office of Ed after I retired from the university. And we've done workshops all over. And it was amazing to see people come after they hear our story. They are amazed that that even happened in Utah. And so it's there, but as I talked to the supervisor of social studies in the state office, I wanted him to be more aware of those kinds of things. So important that people in the state at least know about what's happened. When I did one workshop very close to Delta, they came up and they said they didn't even know there was a camp there. I couldn't believe that. It was just amazing. So it's just awareness. People have to get to know what's happened in history, not only for the Japanese, but for the other ethnic groups too, and all the contributions that they've given to the state. I mean, that should be known. I know in California, we talked a lot about the Spanish people that established in California and such, and what, but in Utah, it was very, they didn't talk much about other groups. And I think that is a mistake.
Yeah. Raymond, do you have
Can I
anything to add on that? Or go ahead, Floyd.
Yeah, I mentioned I took a group down there a couple of weeks ago, and my extended family in Utah heard about that, and now on July 5th, we're going to have a large group of the Mori Mono clan go down to Topaz. A lot of the young people who have never been there and don't know anything about it to go through that museum and to go out to the site and learn more about incarceration. I think this is the intention of that education process that we are obligated to do. And I'm glad to see that my family is beginning to, now we're at 5th, 6th generation, and they want to go out and see what the camp was and learn more about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, you have to want to go see Topaz. You don't just happen to drive through there. It's so remote. And I mean, so people need to make the special effort to go down and see what's there or what used to be there, because there's very little on the actual campsite itself. Now I am going to bring in Trey Imamura. He is one of the leaders of the local JACL chapter. His grandparents were incarcerated in a variety of camps. We talked about this earlier. Bring in him and get his impressions about, the conversation and what he sees, as a younger member of the Japanese American community, and what lessons he has learned and what he can bring to other people going forward.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trey Imamura. I'm one of the co-presidents for the Salt Lake City JACL. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Shirley, for giving me this opportunity to be here to reflect on this panel. It's been really interesting here listening to all the different perspectives, especially perspective from the book and from Judge and Jeanette. There's a lot of parallels in the stories that I have learned from my own grandparents' relation with the war, being Japanese American, and growing up. They too, they were from California. The war happened, and then they were sent to camp, and then they ended up in Utah, of all places. So all these parallels and stories, and we talked about touch points in life, and I think it's just fascinating how my grandparents golfed with Floyd, and now I have the pleasure of being on this Zoom meeting today with Floyd and working with him all the time now. And even with Judge and Jeanette, my grandmother always says, "Oh, Jeanette, was worked or was related to my boss at work, and somehow there's a connection there somehow." And so all these different touch points. And it brings me to this word I learned when I was in Japan on this trip, sponsored by the JACL, called kakehashi. They have this word called okage sama de. And sometimes people say that's, just like a thank you, casual thank you. But I learned it in Japan as a meaning of saying, I am who I am because of you, okage sama de. And so to me, and I'm just speaking from, again, my perspective as a fourth generation, and I can't speak for everybody who's a fourth generation, but there's this whole story that is bigger than just me. And so it's always such an honor to hear all the different perspectives and to see that the struggles of the Issei and the Nisei generations and those before me, that secret of the camps, the shame. And now that it's all being brought up, and it's almost like a call to action to make sure that this never happens again. And so that's when things like visiting Topaz, that's the action we're taking to make sure that people understand the trauma that this created, because we talk about generational trauma and how that passes down, and this is one of those things. So making sure that we talk about it and educate about it, and that's just really one of my biggest things with this topic. And going back to okage sama de, I really think that that's created this, we talk about the JA community, Japanese American community in Salt Lake. And it's just, through the hardship that all the generations went through, I have some of the best friends and in this community. And it's funny that we say, oh, maybe, you should date someone. They're in the JA community. You grew up together. That'd be so great and so awesome. But our whole generation, a lot of us are like, wow, we can't do that because we're so close. We're like family. And it's just one of those things where, gosh, how lucky are we after all of these things that we're able to come together and say that, we have this huge family. So at least for me in this generation, it's very much a time to be reflective on all the struggles that the generations before us went through, and for us to be able to say, we are who we are today. We're grateful because of you, okage sama de.
You mentioned multi-generational trauma, and that's a topic that we've all discussed a number of times. Have you detected signs of that in your own family's lives? Anything that particularly stands out, habits that people may have that you've now kind of traced back to the incarceration or similar experiences?
I have, yeah, and it's actually interesting. My grandmother and her sister always talk about camp. Camp was, we played baseball in camp, and so they talk about it, and I said, internment camp, wasn't it? This is not a fun time for your life, But then their older siblings who, as soon as camp was over, they left. They went to Chicago, and they were like, we need to get out of here because part of their lives were taken in this camp situation. So it's interesting how you have that riff in a family or people moving and those dynamics that carry down. And then my parents and their generation really weren't informed about the internment camp. They knew it happened. They knew, their parents were interned, but as they got older, they learned more. And even as, we were going through school, they would talk more about these things with us. And it was just such, as we learn more about our own history, It's like, wow, the things that are happening to people today happened to generations ago. And if only we would have known how terrible this is, we could have, taken more action to prevent these things that are happening today to migrants that are coming here. So, I think it's the shame that makes it that, like the book says, it's called secret, to make it a secret. And we really need to, instead of being shameful about it, or even not having the space to talk about those things, talk about it, educate about it, because it's important.
Yeah, that reminds me of a part in the book about Judge Uno's dad, Clarence Uno, who was a World War I veteran, incarcerated, worked hard. He was basically one of the go-betweens between the Japanese American community and the outside world to help people assimilate and take care of business. He helped move people from the assembly centers to Heart Mountain, and then unfortunately died there after serving people in a USO meeting. Judge, can you talk to us a little bit about your father and his impact and the impact of his passing on you and your family's lives?
Yeah, my dad passed away when I was 12 years old. And I remember January 21st, I can't remember exactly what. Anyway, I remember his passing away. And I always thought, if he were not in camp, would he have been able to survive? He died of a heart attack, and we called the hospital, and the facilities, medical facilities, were not that good. And by the time the doctor came, his body was already cold. And I always thought to myself, I wonder if they were under different circumstances, would he have survived? But anyway, after having lost my father, I was essentially on my own because my mother, although she's a graduate of Nihon Joshidai, which is one of the, good universities in Japan, she didn't speak English well, so I had very little communication. So after my father died, I was essentially on my own all the time. And that's why I did all the funny things I did. And I appreciate people tolerating all the crazy things I did over my life. Anyway, I appreciate the fact that everybody that I've been in contact with has always been very supportive, and especially Jeanette's husband, Chas. He was my mentor and also my 100% backup. Every time I got into a fist fight or something, he was there to help me.
We got about 15 minutes left, and I know that we've still have some people in the audience who may have been inspired by this conversation to ask any questions. So if you have any, please fill them in the chat, and then I will relay them to the various panelists. Trey, can you talk some more about what you've heard today? Is there anything that you've particularly, heard that's new that has inspired you to do any more research or anything?
I think for me, the Topaz trip, it's always been in my backyard, because I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm actually right now in Los Angeles just working remotely. But on the way here, I drove here, and there's always, we stop by and you drive south, and there's the Delta exit. And I remember thinking, on the way here, gosh, this is like a couple hours away from Salt Lake. This is pretty far. So that was one of the things, at least for me today, that call to action to go and actually visit there. And even looking at where my grandmother was, or one of my grandmothers, she was in Poston, and that's an hour and a half north of Salt Lake in Idaho. And so for me, it's one of those, I've been to the Japanese American Museum here in Los Angeles, where they have a barrack inside, and it's massive. And just the feeling of being there, and I couldn't even be in there for 2 minutes because it was just so cold. So just imagine going to Topaz or to another place where it's actually outside and being there for several years growing up there. So that's kind of what my call to action. They're so close to us. Why not go and see?
Yeah, I mean, I think going to any of those camps is a tremendous eye opener, particularly for people who don't know much about it or have never seen, where they are. One, you feel how remote you are. Two, how Spartan the barracks are, and you imagine people actually had to live in there in the conditions that were at Heart Mountain or Topaz or Manzanar or anything with the wind and the dust. And I think it really brings it home to a lot of people. We do have one comment here from Stephanie Suoka, who says, speaking of connections, my grandma Amy, who was at Poston, and my grandpa Nob, a pioneer onion farmer in Corinne, Utah, relocated Trey's grandparents from Utah to northern Utah shortly after the war. So,
and actually a funny story about that too. It's interesting because my, paternal grandmother, they were in Poston, and she actually remembers Amy. But then my, maternal grandfather was the one that family, they relocated from Helper, Utah to Corinne, Utah. And so they always said, oh yeah, Aunt Amy. And I'm like, who's Aunt Amy? And so, it's just kind of funny how these connections and, Steph being another pillar of our community here in Salt Lake and, a fabulous mentor to all of my generation, mentioned that. And I was like, wow, it's these touch points, like Shirley mentioned, they're all over the place.
Yeah. I have a question here from Kevin Mass, who asks, critical race theory is under attack right now. Do the panelists see parallels between that and the camp experience not being explored more by the general population? Floyd, would you like to tackle that first?
I think very related. People want to avoid that which may reflect negatively. And certainly the camp experience and the treatment of race here in this country are points that we would like to not have in our history, but is there. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who do not want to hear about these kinds of experiences, but they're there, they're important, and I think it's critical that to understand race in our society, we need to understand the incarceration, because it was solely because of race and bigotry that Japanese Americans were incarcerated. They weren't criminals. They were not disloyal. They did not commit crimes, but simply because of race, they were incarcerated and in prison for those over 3 years for many people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I have a question here from Michael Iwasaki from the Salt Lake JACL. He was just wondering, for Jeanette and Judge Uno, is there one memory from the incarceration experience that particularly stands out to you?
Mine is, of course, the death of my father, and it happened just right after we were put into the camp, and so that was kind of a devastating experience for me.
Yeah. Jeanette?
Gosh, I don't know what to say.
Don't look at me, I can't answer.
I guess one of the things, my children will relate to this one. It's like saving every little thing just in case. You save this because it might come in handy here, might save something for there. So throughout my life, I've been saving things, and now I'm trying to unload things. But anyway, in camp, that's what we did. We made things out of little things that, well, actually, it was quite creative. I want to show you this little thing that I made when I was in camp. Oh, see this little thing?
Yeah.
We went to the recreation hall, and so we take scraps of like an orange crate, break it apart, and make objects. And so I really think that kind of stimulated one to become very creative. So I think there was some benefits to being in camp, and also meeting so many different Japanese Americans in camp. And like I said before, it's like connecting the dots. It's amazing how many connections that we have made throughout. And now they're all over the United States. Before there was just in one little community in California, but now we've branched out and it's like one big family, right, Ray?
Ray, it's interesting. I grew up in Utah. I moved away for a number of years, like a couple of decades, and came back. And over that period of time, I've related to everybody in Utah. There is a Japanese American community. And gee, I'm golfing with this guy, and he says, "Do you know that my wife is your wife's cousin?" No, I didn't know that. And so on and on and on. I'm finding that there is becoming more and more connections between various families in Utah. And I'm related to everybody nowadays.
Shirley, I have a question here for you. It comes from Sherry Hayashi, who's one of the people who helped organize this event. She'd be interested in hearing thoughts about the increasing anti-Asian rhetoric and violence and parallels with what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II.
Yes, and thanks to Sherry for helping support this program as well. I mean, I think the similarities are clear. I mean, what happened in 1942 by executive order from a president who had racist tendencies was able to suspend constitutional rights by the stroke of a pen. But the problems of the Japanese American and the Chinese before them, those racial feelings and those attacks on the Asian American community existed before that executive order. And I think we see many similar issues like that today. We had a president who was trying to abuse the executive authority of his presidency. We also see an increased violence against African Americans as well as Asian Americans. And so I think the systemic ties to racism have been there for centuries. And I think it's just playing out again. I think that when a community feels threatened, when there's a war crisis, or if there's something like the pandemic, I think what happens is that it really breeds a lot of insecurity. And I think attacking Asians during the COVID crisis has been part of that similarity. And I think the one thing that we have to remember as Japanese Americans is, the Japanese American community by and large has made it in society. And there are a lot of successful Japanese Americans. I think that success, though, came with a price, and we don't have time to get into that today. And but you got to understand, when I'm in Washington, D.C., and if I walk into Safeway or I walk into Costco or any other store, the community at large sees an Asian face. They can't distinguish between Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. They're not that sophisticated, and they don't, and they really, don't know the difference between some of those cultures. So it's important to remember that we're kind of all in this together, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we have to use our experiences as Japanese Americans to help other communities, because at the end of the day, it really affects all of us. So, but I appreciate that question.
We're running short on time here, but Shirley, I know you have a couple of things that you want to talk about, upcoming events, and then I'll kick it over to Jason Kunisaki to help wrap this thing up.
Yeah, for those of you that are interested in, Jason had mentioned that he has family that was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. Please get on our website, www.heartmountain.org. We do have a pilgrimage that's coming up in July. I believe it's like July 24th. I think Jeanette and Raymond may be trying to drive to that event to be there in person. So if they can drive to Heart Mountain, anybody could drive to Heart Mountain. And also, we've been in communication with Judge Gogo, who I think is listening from Santa Clara. And he's planning on coming to Salt Lake City on, July 28th. And I'm working with Trey and Jason to make sure that he has his 48-star flag, that we'll have it on display at the Buddhist temple. So calling all Nisei, if you've been incarcerated, please come and sign that flag. And we have a special edition of Setsuko's Secret that was signed by Secretary Norman Mineta and Senator Simpson and myself. So anyone who shows up at the Buddhist temple between 1 to 3 on Wednesday, September 28th, we're going to raffle off the book, but you have to bring a Nisei with you. You can't just come up and show you, but anyone's eligible to win. And then also I'll be doing a live event on September 24th, Friday at 6 p.m. at the King's English Bookstore. And we will also raffle off a Simpson and Mineta book if you're able to make it there. So thank you so much.
I just believe that the first event you talked about is July 28th on Wednesday at the Buddhist temple, correct?
Yeah, July 28th at the Buddha. Trey and Jason will get the information out, 1 to 3 p.m.
All right. Well, I think that's enough for me and the panel, and have Jason take over from here. And thanks to everybody for making this a really informative event. And thanks for all your excellent questions.
Yeah, you kind of said exactly what I was going to say. Thanks for all the questions and for all the speakers taking the time to give you great insights. As a transplant, to Salt Lake City, it was really insightful to hear about everybody's background and perspectives on how Utah Japanese American communities have changed over the years. So I hope that was the same for everybody else who might be joining in from another state. I want to close this event by saying a last thank you to the co-sponsors for sponsoring and advertising for this event. And another reminder that you can get Setsuko's Secret from the King's English Bookstore, both in person and online. For those in Salt Lake, it's at the intersection of 15th South and 15th East in Salt Lake City. So with that, I'd like to wish everybody a great weekend and stay hydrated in this warm summer. Thank you.